Greetings. The next lecture I'd like to talk to you today about is basically the idea of arguments versus non-arguments. Not everything you encounter in life or in this class is an argument. Just don't assume everything's an argument. Because some things aren't. And if you apply a level of scrutiny in which you're saying it's an argument, I'm going to evaluate it that way, you're just not doing yourself any favors. It's not an argument. So, sorry, I thought I was back at the beginning. And so we basically have to come up with this idea. Not everything's an argument. There are other uses of language, and we need to make sure we're not using an argument. The key to an argument is that it has an inferential claim. It's not just making statements, that there's an actual inferential claim. There's an attempt to not just have a factual claim. A lot of non-arguments claim that they have facts, but that they're also attempting to They're attempting to prove a reason towards them. Arguments have some characteristics. They have to be able to identify a conclusion statements used to support it. So you need to be able to find the parts, premises, and conclusion. There also must be an inferential claim, meaning the premises must claim to support the conclusion. So not just can you find the parts, but there is an actual reasoning process existing. There must be a dispute about the conclusion. It's not really an argument if there's widely accepted information. It's really more of an explanation. And there must be a practical difference between each side of the debate. If it's really fairly minute, it's not really practical, then we wouldn't really consider it an argument anyway. There's no real dispute to evaluate. Now, there are different types. There's warnings or pieces of advice. A warning is just something like, watch out. But it can also go to something as long as a lecture from your parents that can be quite lengthy. And that might begin to resemble an argument, but it's not, because it's not intended to reason towards something. It's just trying to make a point and tell you what's right or wrong. Watch out. Don't speed. Don't speed. A lot of cops are out this weekend. A lot of cops are out this weekend may seem like a premise, but it's not. It's essentially just part of a warning. It's giving a little further explanation, but it's not an actual argument. It's not trying to convince you of anything. It's just simply providing you with information as part of the warning. Simple statement of belief or mere opinion. Arguments may involve opinions, but these are ones that lack the inferential claim. You need to have a reasoning process. Basically, arguments have opinions sometimes. But the difference is there's also an inferential claim, that there's a reasoning process. If you have something like movies are boring, movies about vampires are boring, movies about ducks are silly, there's multiple sentences, but there's no inference, there's no reasoning process, it's just a statement. Ice cream is yucky. It's just a statement of opinion. There's no argument, there's just a statement. Loosely associated ideas. You may have a lot of statements that seem to be on the same topic, but there's not really an argument. I sometimes say in my class, I have this one class right now, it's a classroom class, and I sometimes say, they are, sometimes they'll talk about things, and they'll all just say their opinion, but they're not really arguing for anything. They're just saying what they think. And so there's just loosely associated ideas. They're talking about the same thing, they're giving their opinion, but nobody's really arguing, they're just talking. And I'm trying to get them to do more, but oftentimes, these are just a bunch of statements. Dogs are great, cats are okay, ferrets are the best, but a lot of work. Just loosely associated ideas. They're about animals, but they're not constructed in a reasoning process. Reports of information. These are just accounts. They're not arguments. A newspaper argument tell you a crime occurred. Like, so-and-so, is, accused of murder, and they then tell you what happened. They're not giving you an argument. They're just telling you what happened. So it's not an argument. It's really just a report of information. Tell your friends about your vacation. You're not giving an argument. You may have a point, like I had a good time, but that's not an argument. You're just recounting or reporting information. Expository passage. An expository passage is basically where you have a topic sentence and then you develop it. But that doesn't make it an argument. It's just basically development, talking more about the point you made. There's a stylized relation of an artist to mass audience in sports, especially baseball. Each player develops the style of his own, the swagger, the pitch, the swing, etc. Essentially, you have a topic sentence, there's a stylized relation of artist to mass audience in the sports, and then you have just more talk about it, more explanation. Not really explanation, just more talk about it. Illustrations and examples. Illustrations and examples sometimes can seem like, oh, well, they're giving me an analogy to prove it. Well, I suppose it could be. It really makes a difference in are they trying to just give you an example, or are they trying to argue for something? And so usually if you're just giving examples or illustrating your point, you're not giving an argument, you're just giving an example or illustrating your point. They sometimes will have premise and conclusion indicators, so be careful about those. But that doesn't make them. For example, chemical elements can be represented by molecular formulas. Thus, oxygen is represented by O. Okay? They have a statement about chemical elements can be represented by molecular formulas, and then they're giving an example of that. Alright. Oops. I just skipped all the way past conditional statements. Alright. Explanation. These are similar to arguments because there's sort of a form. There's the point that they're trying to explain too, but there's also the support, the explanation itself. And so they sometimes will confuse you. But remember, it's an explanation if they're not trying to prove their point. They're just trying to explain why it's true. If you're just explaining, you're not really arguing for something. There's no, remember, it has to have a point of disagreement. So if it's not that, if it's just explaining, then it's not really an argument. Cows digest grass while humans cannot because their digestive systems contain enzymes not found in humans. Cows digest grass while humans cannot may appear to be a conclusion, but because it's widely accepted, it's not. It's just an explanation of that. Conditional statements. If-then statements are what we call conditional statements. These are not arguments in and of themselves. They're just statements. If I say, if this, then that, it's not doing anything other than just a statement. If that happens, then this will happen. It's not an argument. It's not saying that if part is true. It's just simply a statement. Now, they're showing a relationship between the if and the part. If you pass the exam, then you studied. Okay? That's a statement. If you pass, then you studied. Now, the thing is we should at least first off say that, they're going to be very important in this class, conditional statements. But we also need to know that there are names we give to the parts of a conditional statement. The part that follows the if we call the antecedent. And the part that follows the then we call the consequent. To a certain degree, an if-then statement, if this, then that, it's the consequence of the antecedent. So we call it the consequence. Now, so in a statement like, if John goes to the party, then Lisa will, the if part follows it. John goes to the party. The then part is Lisa will. So that's the consequent. The John goes to the party is the antecedent. You could also write this as Lisa will go to the party if John goes. The part that follows the if is John goes. So therefore, it's still the antecedent. And then the other part is essentially the then. It's the consequence of if John goes, then this is going to happen. Now, remember though, conditional statements of logic are about showing a different type of relationship than maybe what you're used to. They're not showing a temporal, they're not showing anything else. They're showing a necessary, sufficient relationship. And what that means is that any time the antecedent is true, the consequent necessarily will be true. Okay? And the antecedent is sufficient to prove the consequent. And so that's what it's showing, is it shows the antecedent is sufficient to prove the consequent, and the consequent will necessarily be true anytime the antecedent is true. Now, that means that the antecedent will be sufficient to explain the consequent, and the consequent will be necessarily true anytime the antecedent is true. Already said that. We use this sort of abbreviation SUN. In logic, we have a thing called a horseshoe, which is just sort of a U, which is tilted on its side. And we use that to symbolize if-then. If-then. So the S, so basically this we would translate as if S, then then. That's SUN. If S, then N. And what essentially the S is the sufficient. So the antecedent is always a sufficient condition, and the N, the consequent, is always the necessary condition. And what that means is anytime the antecedent is true, the consequent necessarily will be true. So the consequent is a necessary condition, and the antecedent is sufficient to cause the other to be true. So we call it a sufficient condition. Now, there is one exception. There's one thing you should keep in mind. If you use the word only if, you say, oh, well, it has if, so that must be signaling the antecedent. Well, no, actually, it's signaling the consequence. And essentially what's happening is this is showing a sufficient necessary relationship. So, like, if I will help you only if you ask nicely. That means that my help, that my help, if I am helping you, then you ask nicely, is what that's saying. I will help you only if you ask nicely. So essentially what happens is the helping you is sufficient to prove that you ask nicely. And that's why we translate it as if, the only if, as the consequence instead of the antecedent. Now, we can also think about necessary and sufficient conditionals. Necessary means that it is true and it can't be otherwise. Being a mammal is a necessary condition to being a dog. Okay? Being a mammal is a necessary condition to being a dog. If you're a dog, you have to be a mammal, so it's necessary. Being a dog is sufficient condition for being a mammal. If you're a dog, that's sufficient to prove you're also a mammal, because all dogs are mammals. Now remember, conditional statements aren't arguments, they're just simply showing a relationship. They can be a premise in an argument, they can be a conclusion, they can be all conditional statements in an argument. But they themselves are not arguments. And please remember, conditional statements are showing a sufficient necessary relationship. They're not showing a temporal, they're not showing a causal relationship. They are showing that if this happens, then the other will necessarily follow. Good luck, and remember, not everything is an argument. So don't try to apply the same level of scrutiny to things that aren't actually arguments.